On a narrow shelf high above the Mediterranean Sea, just west of the modern city of Malaga, a small limestone cave opens into darkness. A single human skull lies half buried in calcified sediment beneath a low overhang, its surface etched with fine layers of time. The rock around it is not just stone, it's a chronicle, each mineral deposit, a year written in silence. Beneath the earth, far below where this skull rests, something shifted long before humans ever walked into these caves. It began not with fire or war, but with cold, sudden and deep. Around 6200 BCE, perhaps within a single generation, the world's climate snapped like a frozen river cracking underfoot. In the high Arctic, ice sheets that had been retreating for millennia suddenly surged forward again, locking up vast amounts of water in their white embrace. The planet cooled by several degrees across temperate zones, rapid enough to leave no time for slow adaptation. In Mesopotamia, where rivers flowed gently through fertile plains, a quiet change took hold. Rainfall patterns shifted. The winds that once carried moisture from distant seas now blew dry and empty. In Anatolia, farmers who had just begun planting emmer wheat in low terraced fields found their soil drying under an unrelenting sun. The irrigation systems they'd built with such care, stone channels carved into hillsides, became clogged, useless. Along the coasts of what is now Syria and southern Turkey, ancient shorelines were left high and dry as sea levels dropped by several meters in just decades. Clamshells lay exposed on land that had once been seabed. The rhythm of life along those shores collapsed. Fishing communities, abandoned villages built for centuries. People packed their tools into baskets and began moving away from the new arid edges, away from what was failing. This was no gradual drift toward hardship. It was a pulse, a single violent shock in Earth's long breath. And though we cannot hear it now, its echoes are still in our bones, in the spread of agriculture, in the rise of cities, in how far and fast people moved when the ground beneath them turned unkind. 10,000 years after the last ice sheets retreated, human societies were still finding their footing in a world reshaped by thawing glaciers and rising seas. Across the Fertile Crescent, villages had begun to flourish where river floods once washed over seasonal marshes. Settlements like Jericho and Çatalhöyük were already decades old when a quiet shift began deep within Earth's systems. The climate was stable, warm, and predictable in ways it hadn't been since before the last ice age. This era of relative calm had become the foundation upon which agriculture took root. Villages grew into towns, and population densities climbed steadily. But beneath that stability, something shifted, suddenly and powerfully. Around 6200 BCE, a great pulse of cold swept across the northern hemisphere, like breath from a sleeping giant. It was not a gradual cooling, but an abrupt climatic reversal. Temperatures dropped sharply in just a few years, possibly within a single decade. Ice cores from Greenland show it with startling clarity. Sudden spikes in oxygen isotopes signaling colder air and harsher weather patterns, particularly across the North Atlantic region. This wasn't some slow drift into winter. It was a systemic reorganization of atmospheric circulation, likely triggered by meltwater floods from collapsing ice dams in northern Canada. That surge disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, weakening ocean currents that had long transported heat to Europe and North Africa. The result was a sudden freeze across vast swathes of land. Temperatures plummeted as much as 5 degrees Celsius over just decades. In Egypt, The Nile's seasonal flooding, which had supported early agriculture for centuries, became erratic. In Mesopotamia, where fields were only beginning to be cultivated under fertile soils and reliable rains, sudden droughts began to stress growing crops. Coastal regions, where sea levels continued their slow rise after deglaciation, now faced compounded pressures from both climate change and shifting shorelines. The world had been changing for millennia, but this was different. Not a gradual adaptation, but a crisis in the making, a pause that would alter human destiny forever. The evidence for the 8.2 kiloyear event emerges from layers of Earth's memory, frozen, sedimentary, and organic, that record abrupt shifts in climate with remarkable precision. In Greenland, ice cores a distinct spike in oxygen isotope ratios reveals a sudden drop in temperature, locked within annual layers of ice that formed over millennia. These isotopic signals are not isolated. They align across multiple boreholes drilled into the polar ice sheet, confirming an event so widespread it could only be planetary in scale. The cooling lasted approximately 150 years, short in geological time, but profound for human societies adapting to stable conditions. In lake sediments from around the world, a corresponding shift appears. Dark bands rich in organic material and altered pollen assemblages signal a drying of wetlands and a retreat of forests into higher elevations. In the Near East, where agriculture first took root, archaeological sites like Tel Abu Huraira show abrupt abandonment after centuries of continuous habitation, dirt layers revealing collapsed granaries and burnt remains suggest famine or forced departure. The transition from cultivated grain to wild grasses in soil samples reflects not just environmental change, but human response. Marine cores taken from the Mediterranean and Arabian Sea reveal a drop in sea surface temperatures and shifts in ocean currents, consistent with weakened monsoon systems over northern Africa and South Asia. In some coastal regions, evidence of sudden shoreline retreat, eroded cliff faces or submerged settlements suggests rapid changes in sea level driven by glacial melt pulses. All these lines converge. Ice cores offer the clearest temporal precision, directly measuring temperature shifts year by year. Sediment records provide ecological context, the impact on plants and animals, and are cross-verified across continents. Archaeological sites deliver human testimony, abandonment, migration patterns, changes in settlement form. While no written record from that time survives, the physical traces speak with a consistency that transcends speculation. Together, they build not just a timeline, but an intimate portrait of climate as a shaping force. Silent, sudden, and irreversible for those who lived through it. In a village nestled along the edge of what was once fertile lowland, now cracked earth and stubborn reeds, a woman lifts her eyes from the sowing line she's drawn in the soil. The seed is small, brittle, much smaller than it used to be. Her hands, calloused from years of tending barley that no longer fills baskets as before, hesitate. Last year's harvest barely fed the children through winter. This season, the rains come late and sharp, like needles on stone. She knows the soil has grown thin beneath her feet, less forgiving than it was when her mother walked these fields. Her husband walks toward the riverbank at dawn, where once he waded into knee-deep water to drag nets from clear currents, now choked with silt. The fish have vanished upstream and downstream alike. They no longer know which streams still hold life, or if they'll find enough to boil over a fire that barely flickers. In the clay-walled huts of the high ridge, families press close under reed-thatched roofs, their hearths dimmed by smoke from damp wood. Children cough in corners where cold seeps through gaps in mud walls. The old man with the crooked spine remembers when the valley was green, when the wind carried pollen instead of dust. They trade what little they have, a goat's milk for a scrap of woven cloth, a stone tool sharpened on flint for a handful of emigraine that might sprout in clay pots if light is left. They move their herds slowly, choosing higher ground where snow lingers longer, but the wind does not howl through open slopes. Some speak of stories from beyond the mountains, of farmland still golden under strange suns, but no one dares ask aloud, would it be worth leaving? The path is long, the sky has turned fickle, and every dawn now carries a question they have never asked before. Can we stay? The real turning point was not gradual, but abrupt, a single pulse of cooling that struck across continents within a generation span. Around 6200 BCE, something changed in the atmosphere and ocean currents. A sudden disruption sent cold air surging from the north, while ice-laden meltwater poured into the North Atlantic. This wasn't slow climatic drift, it was a system shock, a shiver across the Earth's weather engine. The temperature dropped by several degrees within decades, enough to freeze lake surfaces in temperate zones where they hadn't frozen for millennia, and to shorten growing seasons dramatically. The effect rippled through ecosystems already adapting to post-ice age conditions. Grasslands dried under unseasonable cold, forests retreated as frost killed seedlings and hindered regeneration. In river deltas stretching from Mesopotamia to the Nile basin, shifting rainfall patterns altered water flows. Some rivers swelled unpredictably, others dwindled into seasonal trickles. For human societies dependent on predictable harvests, this was not a minor inconvenience, but an existential test. In northern Mesopotamia and the Levant, early farming communities had begun cultivating wheat and barley in river valleys where moisture levels were stable. Now, drought stress weakened crops. When rain returned sporadically, floods scoured fields already stripped of protective vegetation. The soil eroded, yields collapsed. In the Fertile Crescent, a region that birthed agriculture, this climate shift may have been one of the first recorded triggers of agricultural crisis. Migration patterns began to warp under pressure. Populations who had settled near fertile riverbanks, families rooted in place for generations, began moving toward more reliable water sources or higher ground as floodplains became unstable. Some groups moved inland, others followed coastlines where sea levels were rising due to glacial meltwater and changing ocean currents. Coastal settlements across what is now the Arabian Peninsula and southern Iran saw sudden abandonment, while others emerged farther from shore. This was not a single event, but an acceleration of environmental stress that tested human resilience in ways no prior generation had faced. The climate did not merely change, it destabilized systems upon which early farming communities depended, and it forced choices with consequences that would echo through millennia: to adapt or move, to endure or perish. The question wasn't just survival, it was whether civilization could hold together when the world itself seemed to falter. The climate pulse struck with a suddenness that defies easy reckoning. No slow drift, but a decisive shift, abrupt enough to leave its mark in sediment layers and ice cores across continents. In the space of a generation or two, temperatures dropped sharply across northern latitudes. Winter snows lingered longer, growing seasons shortened, and river flows diminished in places where they had once been reliable. Coastal zones began to feel the change too. The rise in sea level from melting glaciers had already begun altering shorelines, but now seasonal flooding became more frequent. encroaching on low-lying fields and settlements that had stood for generations. In Mesopotamia, fertile river valleys saw growing conditions deteriorate beneath a dry sky. The Tigris and Euphrates carried less water in their spring pulses. Marshlands shrank, and the balance between farming and survival tipped toward scarcity. In the Nile Valley, though rainfall remained relatively stable, changing wind patterns may have disrupted monsoon rhythms upstream, affecting silt deposition, crucial to agriculture. Meanwhile, mountain regions in Anatolia and the Zagros saw grasslands give way to alpine scrub. Herders who depended on seasonal grazing routes found their paths blocked or untenable. These environmental shifts did not unfold uniformly, nor were they experienced identically by all communities. In some places, populations retreated into more defensible terrain. Hilltop encampments became common in the Levant, and fortified villages emerged where open plains once hosted temporary camps. Elsewhere, particularly in regions with already fragile food systems, pressure mounted on existing resources. There is evidence that social cohesion strained under scarcity. Settlements were abandoned en masse, not through catastrophic collapse, but through quiet dispersal. Families moving northward into more hospitable zones, others turning inland toward higher ground, or river valleys still fed by seasonal streams. Migration patterns shifted as well, not in great waves, but in steady pulses of movement across shifting thresholds. The pressure was not immediate, nor were the consequences always visible at first glance. Yet over several decades, a new rhythm entered human life. Uncertainty became routine, adaptation a necessity. The world had not ended, but it had changed. And for many communities, survival now depended less on what had worked before than on whether they could adjust in time. Despite decades of research, several fundamental questions remain unresolved. The precise timing of the cooling's onset, whether it arrived suddenly over weeks or unfolded gradually across a few years, is still debated. Ice core data suggest rapid shifts in temperature and atmospheric composition, but marine sediment records from different regions show variation in both the magnitude and duration of change. What one site reads as a sharp plunge may appear more gradual elsewhere, complicating efforts to reconstruct a single global timeline. Equally uncertain is how uniformly this event affected all human communities. While some archaeological sites show abrupt abandonment or cultural shifts, like the sudden depopulation of low-lying river valleys in Mesopotamia, others reveal resilience or adaptation. Some populations appear to have weathered the cold without major disruption, possibly due to local environmental buffers or adaptive strategies not yet visible in the record. A persistent myth is that this event single-handedly caused the collapse of early civilizations. In truth, no society collapsed overnight. Instead, the climate shift acted as a stressor, pushing already complex societies toward thresholds they might not have crossed otherwise. The rise of agriculture and urbanization had created interdependencies that made communities vulnerable to disruption in rainfall or crop yields. Yet we cannot say this event caused farming's first failure. It merely exposed its fragility. Another common misunderstanding is the assumption that all cooling occurred simultaneously across continents. In reality, regional climates diverged. While parts of Eurasia cooled sharply, some tropical zones experienced increased monsoon activity, possibly even more rainfall than before. The global picture was not uniform but patchwork, a mosaic of environmental pressures rather than a single synchronized crisis Finally, the role of human agency remains unclear. Did people migrate because the land became uninhabitable, or did they move in response to social or political changes, using climate as just one factor among many? We can track movements and shifts, but not always the motivations behind them. The evidence shows patterns, migration corridors, settlement vacating, new cultural alignments, but interpreting intention requires more than data. It demands caution. What endures is not a single moment, but the rhythm of adaptation written into the bones and soil of human memory. The cold did not last forever, yet its echo persists in the way settlements shifted, in the patterns of abandonment and rebirth across river valleys and coastal plains. There was no grand decree from above. Instead, a subtle shift in wind patterns, a sudden quieting of rains over Mesopotamia, a thinning of ice sheets that sent meltwater surging into oceans and altering currents. These were the unseen hands reshaping the world beneath human feet. We find it not only in layers of sediment or pollen counts, but in the silence between stories, in the way early farming communities abandoned their fields for generations before reoccupying them under new forms, in the persistence of certain crop patterns across millennia, as if survivors had learned to read the land differently, less like a promise, more like a negotiation. The event does not linger because it was catastrophic in a single stroke. It endures because it exposed something fragile, that stability is not natural, but earned through constant recalibration, that the rhythms of life are tied not just to soil and seed, but to invisible planetary systems, systems humans could barely perceive, yet depended upon completely. What remains unsettled is whether this moment was a singular turning point, or merely one in a long sequence of environmental pressures that shaped humanity's path. But what we can carry forward is the quiet truth. Change does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives as an adjustment, a shift in weather patterns too slow to feel but too sharp for survival. And so it still matters. Not because we need to relive the past, but because every time the world shifts beneath us, we are reminded of those who stood where we stand now, listening to wind and water, learning how to breathe